Sophie, it is absolutely wonderful to have you with me. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Delighted, absolutely delighted. In fact, I'm between doing a speaking gig this morning and the close this afternoon. So perfect, managed to get that in without having to change the date.
You love to pack a load of stuff into your day. So anyway, but let's talk about motivation, because motivation is the thing that you're passionate about and is your area of expertise. So let's dive right in. And there's a lot of talk about motivation. Why did you decide to study it in depth yourself?
Well, I've always been really driven, and it's something that's fascinated me because I used to look around and think, why isn't everybody else like this? So I've done lots of things over the years. I'm sure you'll talk about this later on in the interview, but I wanted to write a new book about 3 years ago. I wanted to refocus and get very, very narrow and deep in one topic. And I actually didn't think that it was complete somehow. So I thought, well, let's do a bit of research and see where it takes me. And initially, I wanted to just write a book about really driven people, because that's where I get my energy from, is people who are really passionate about things and really highly motivated without any external forces driving them. And I figured if I wrote a book about them, I know it's a bit of a cheat, but I knew I'd get to spend lots of time with really motivated people. So that's what I did. And I found 50 people across lots of disciplines, sports, the arts, science, all sorts of different endeavours. But the one thing they had in common, they were really highly motivated. So I started off, I suppose, where most people start looking at motivation. You go to the standard texts, like Daniel Pink's Drive, which was a study of studies. And it's an amazing book. He's a brilliant writer, and all those studies are very solid. So I think he used about 190 odd studies and a big team of researchers pulling all the key findings out. And then I started doing my own research through these interviews, and something flipped, because although Pink's work said that it's mastery, autonomy, purpose are the three tenets of what businesses aren't doing well enough yet, that we're still extrinsically rewarding people with bonuses and with finance, with money and those types of rewards, that's not why people really get deeply internally motivated. It's mastery, it's autonomy, and it's purpose. But when I started doing the interviews, what happened, there was a little question in the list of 20 questions I sent out to these people in advance of the interviews that just seemed to hijack the interviews. They just got stuck on this question and never moved beyond question 3. And the question was, when did you first realise that you were more motivated or driven than other people? And what was really shocking, astounding, was that people went back to childhood memories. And it was usually between the ages of 8 and about 13. And it was stuff that people told me they hadn't thought about, memories they'd never really linked to their motivation. So that was really odd. And I knew I was onto something when that happened. I sort of caught a little golden thread, and I just pulled at it and picked at it until I really uncovered what was really going on.
That's fantastic. And it's interesting, you said you studied 50 people. Was that number important?
No, I just kept, initially I was going to do about 30 because I thought that was as many as I could manage to keep it boundaried for the book. And then I just kept meeting interesting people I didn't expect, and I just kept adding to the numbers. Don't let me do it again for a few years, because it's just a vast amount of work, and only about 10% of it made it into the book, of course. But from a marketing perspective, which I haven't really started book marketing it yet, in fact, although it came out last year, this is a tip for anybody who's doing a book. If you're doing an interview-based book, a lot of those people have platforms of their own. So by involving them, so for example, it just looks like I've lost the connection for a second.
No, we're good.
Oh, okay, good. So one of the things, for example, I interviewed a lady called Dory Clark, and Dory's a big up-and-coming speaker in the US. She's traveling globally now. She's got 3 successful books out with Harvard Business Review. And Dory was fantastic to interview. And of course, she has a huge platform. So when Dory tweeted the book with herself on the cover and put it on LinkedIn, I think we sold about 400 copies within 24 hours. So actually linking into other people with a platform is a really helpful tip.
That's really good, very insightful. So in the book, and as part of your study, you discovered 5 motivation types, and you call them flames.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is lovely. Can you explain to us what those 5 types are?
Yeah, well, I come from an NLP practitioner, master practitioner background. So I'm very interested in the metadata behind things, which is the data about the data. And what I recognized was, once I started to decode the interviews, those childhood memories that I mentioned a few moments ago, they were all feelings that people described to me. So people were describing feelings of being in the moment, or winning something, or being part of a team. And they were the earliest memories that drove them. And once I started to decode the feelings, it started to make sense of what were apparently often quite disjointed decisions people have made, or disjointed careers. Because what they were doing, they were following a particular pattern that gave them a certain type of feedback. And that's what the flames are. They are a group of identified feelings that people are chasing to repeat over and over again.
And of those 50, did you have 10, 10, 10, 10? Or was there one flame that was more than another?
What turned out to be the case was that it became very obvious what career choices people had made once they described the feelings they enjoyed. So, for example, if I give you the 5 very briefly, the first one is flow, and that's people that are really good at getting in the zone and being in the moment. There's inclusion, which is people being part of a team, and inclusion-driven people are often at the heart of networks, and they're very high influence people. Even if they're not hugely educated, they're often the invisible power brokers in an organization or a network. Then you have results-based people who don't care about inclusion necessarily, they just want to win. And those people had often come from a background where they'd had to really prove themselves, and they might have won something. And it could have been something apparently insignificant that they often remembered during the interview. So they might have won a medal at sports day on school. And for the first time, they were really looked up to or respected or praised by somebody. And that sort of feeling of winning stuck. And then you get people who are very artistic. I call them artisans. And they have to express themselves. And they're poets and writers and speakers and animators and video games designers and Pixar studio people. They're great storytellers. They sing, they dance, they act. It's all about human expression, and that thread went through every single thing that they did, even their hobbies. You ask an expression person what they do, they love art galleries, or they're part of a choir or something like that. And then the last one was discovery motivation, where people are intensely curious, and they're your Brian Coxes. A little story, actually. I was away last week. I was in Aspen, and I was sitting on a ski bus, and the guy next to me, very polite, everybody's very polite in Aspen, said to me, "Hi, are you here on vacation, or are you here on business?" And I said, "Well, some and some." He said, "Oh, me too." I said, "What are you here for?" I'm here on a conference." He said, I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I'm a particle physicist." Brilliant. And it turns out this guy was, you don't get more curious than people who want to explore dark matter and the Big Bang, right? And he invited me and any of the group I was with to a physics lecture. So we went to a physics lecture with one of the 12 people who were the core team that designed the experiments that discovered the Higgs boson at CERN particle.
That's quite cool.
That was like really cool. I thought, I'm sitting on the ski bus with this weird guy, and then we went to this lecture, and there was a whole room full of people that were there, fascinated by what happened at the beginning of time. And so that's a great example of people who are just driven to ask difficult questions and discover things. And in organizations, they're often the grit in the oyster, because they don't settle. They always want to know the next level and how it can be a bit better. And it's not always well received, but they're the real innovators in an organisation. So to learn how to nurture those people and where that curiosity comes from was fascinating. So, of course, and everybody has a flip side. Everyone has a demotivator, and they clash. So flow people need to focus, and inclusion people need people. And they don't necessarily work that well together until you know how to balance those two things.
I mean, when you explain it, it's so simple and it's so obvious and it's so clear. And I can see, and I'm going to ask you to tell me more, but I can see how this would be so helpful if you can understand, the different types of people. You must go around when you meet people and immediately say, oh, I know what type of person you are, because it must be there all the time. So when you understand what type of people you have in your organization, how might you then perhaps lead them differently? Do you lead them differently? You sort of said that some people need different things. So I imagine that you would have to give different environments. Can you do that?
Yeah, well, on a practical level, the main purpose of the whole concept is that it's a really simple tool that people can have on an infographic that they can use as a day-to-day management tool on themselves. So that it helps people become aware that not everybody's the same, which sounds obvious, but most people think that everybody else thinks like they do. So to help people realize that there's another perspective. And this morning I've been in a group of 50 healthcare managers from all over the country, and they manage a team of about 2,000 people between them. So there's a lot of complexity, and knowing what drives one person isn't particularly useful in that environment. But the pennies were dropping all over the room as I was talking about this, because they started to understand their own behaviour, why they're attracted to certain things. And unsurprisingly, in a healthcare environment, a lot of them were inclusion motivated, because they're people, right? But there's clashes. So they then understood a bit better from a business perspective about the results that the organisation needs to get and why that needs to be more detached. So they started being able to talk to the results-based people and the accountants and the finance director and the managing director who were in the room. They started to get a bit more sympathetic to the challenges they face. So within an hour and a half, the whole room was operating more as a team and understanding each other better. And there were some specific instances where the managers were recognising people in their team who need solitude, or who need to be more included, or who need to be held more accountable. So each of the 5 things, as I've worked on it, and I've done some work with Cranfield School of Management on this as well, and they've helped me develop some tools around it, is that for people who are flow driven are very good at being naturally focused. Now, if you're not naturally focused, that's something that you can learn, but it helps you identify where your gaps are without a huge psychometric. Psychometrics are brilliant, but people tend to forget about them after they've initially done the report. Whereas because this is an infographic, they can keep going back to it. Inclusion people naturally tend to be good at teamwork, but not everybody is. Some people need to learn relationship skills, so it highlights that. Results people are naturally very self-accountable. They're very good at holding themselves to account, and others are very responsible. Not everybody finds that easy, so they can learn something from that and teach people to be more ruthlessly self-accountable. So the top sports people are ruthlessly self-accountable. Expression people are very good at communicating with people, keeping channels open, expressing themselves. Not everybody finds that easy. So that's a leadership quality people can work on. And discovery is all about innovation. They're great innovators. Not everybody is naturally inquisitive, but you can teach that. You can teach people to structure questions and see the value of that. So it's just it's only 5 things and it's a picture, but people can relate to it really well about where they might improve their own performance. And I don't think you really understand your own material until it's in the wild, as I say, until it goes out in front of groups of people and you start to work out that actually this people have a different take on it than the one that you expect, and that always surprises me.
And can you be more than one, or are you naturally more? Are you naturally more one type, and you might have a bit of something else?
Great question. So what I found is we nearly all have one dominant one. That's the one we veer to first. So under times of stress, we'll go into report talk, or we'll go into collaboration mode, or we'll go into expressing ourselves mode, or we go into asking questions. So there's a default, but it's usually very heavily balanced by a secondary one. And the ratios really matter. So let me give you an example. One of the people I interviewed was a guy called Hester. And Carl is won the Olympic team gold in London in 2012. He's a dressage rider, and his pupil won individual gold in London and also won individual gold in Rio in 2016. So the current Olympic, European world champion and current world record holder. Now, Carl is very, very flow driven. He's very in the moment. It's why he can train dressage horses, because he's very connected to this animal. He's gifted. His pupil, Charlotte, is much more results driven. So Carl will never sacrifice flow to get a result. So they're both flow and results, but she's the other way around. She will sacrifice the flow. She'll cover up a problem in order to win the medal. And that's what makes her world-class competitively. As a coach, Carl is the better coach because he won't lose the flow. He's always looking for that mastery. And he teaches people to look for that mastery. So the ratios are as important as the secondary flame. And of course, we've all got some of all of them. And it's contextual. So we'll do different things in our personal life than we will in business, for example. We'll often balance itself out. You get results people, for example, who are very down the line, who sing in a choir at weekends. Because we all need to express ourselves, right?
I love it. That's brilliant. I mean, I could go into this in so much detail, but you said something and I want to come onto that. You talked about dressage riding, and I know that that's something that you have been very successful in too, and you're very modest about your successes. What lessons have you taken from your career in dressage that you've been able to apply in business?
Wow. Well, that took me a long time to work out, Maria. I'll be quite honest with you. And I didn't see it initially till other people started asking me. And what's strange is that I've come back to it after 20 years and I've got a new horse that's not far off coming out at Grand Prix. So it's become very close to my heart, that question. I think the biggest one that I've learned most recently, not from the back in the days, but the now times, is that I hadn't appreciated just how much we incrementally improve. To train a dressage horse from breaking it in to Olympic standard, it doesn't mean it's Olympic quality, but it can do all the moves that the Olympics require. At a minimum is a 5-year process. And that's if the horse doesn't get injured, if the rider's done it before and knows what they're doing and has been through the process before, and everything is on your side, it's a 5-year process. And when I was younger, I was always in a hurry to complete the process. And consequently, horses got injured and things go wrong because you put too much pressure on the animal and on yourself. And these days, I've started to understand the power of cumulative process, of incremental improvements. It's a great comparison for leadership because you don't always see how much you've improved today. It's only when you look backwards what you would have done that you realize how much you've changed. And you can take something very ordinary. My current horse is a very ordinary horse. In fact, I remember somebody saying to me when she was 5, "You're not going to train that for dressage, are you?" And I was really quite offended. And I almost went, well, now you've said that, yes. And I didn't. I've just plodded on with good training and good process and not being over ambitious. And it's amazing how far you go. So the power of process, that's one that's really sunk in. Self-discipline is a big one because it can actually be quite, from the outside, it's a boring process. You go round in circles for 5 years. So, you have to be very focused on knowing what you're trying to achieve each day. Otherwise, you just go around in circles and don't achieve anything. I think a lot of people spend their careers like that because they don't necessarily know exactly where they're going. So it's helped me be very clear about the vision, about what you want success to look like. Self-discipline, focus, power of process, a big one. Just the power of repetition, how much we need to do things before they get ingrained. Obviously, communicating with an animal is an interesting one. People are challenging, aren't they? We were saying in the gig this morning with the healthcare professionals, pesky people. Life would be really easy if it wasn't for people. And it's difficult managing people and communicating with people. But on a dressage horse, they've got no sense of purpose. They would just much rather be in a field eating grass. They don't speak English and they weigh about half a ton. So we're intrinsically at a massive disadvantage. So you really learn to get quite creative in your communication skills. And the most frightening thing about it is that horses are a mirror. So they just do what you ask them to do. And you can pretend all you like that the horse has its own mind. It does, and that can make it complicated. But ultimately, they will only do what you ask them to do. And if you don't ask them, they won't do it. So they are a walking mirror. And I think we sort of get that in our lives, but it's not always that easy to admit to that. We tend to get, quality of your communication is the response you get. Well, that really becomes very true on horseback. So
so many things, Sophie, there that you can apply. I mean, the things that I pulled out of there that I really love and I relate to, the incremental change is so important. And looking at, you're comparing against you previously rather than looking at somebody else, but looking at how you have come along, I think is invaluable. I love that. I love the bit about, going round and round and doing the same thing, because I always say to people, you may have 20 years experience in the industry, but is it 20 times the same year, or is it 20 different years? Because there are people that I come across and I think, gosh, you haven't experienced very much at all, because you've just had the same year over and over again, haven't you?
My dressage coach says exactly that. And I think one of the other things I forgot to mention, which is probably one of the most powerful things I've taken from it that helps me every day, is that the ability to take criticism. Because when you're being coached as a sports person, and although I'm at an amateur level, I still take it seriously. And my coach has trained 35 Olympians. So they take no prisoners at all. And on a daily basis, I get screamed at. And you can't answer back because it defeats the object. You're not listening when you're thinking of how to riposte. So that ability to take criticism and feedback on the chin, and in a management situation, it will be feedback. In a dressage situation, it's just criticism, and it's often got expletives at both ends. You have to just take it on the chin and learn to swallow it and learn from it. I heard a fantastic thing the other day from a businessman who said to me he'd made a huge financial mistake that cost him very dearly. And his coach said to him, look, before you write it off and keep getting angry about it, while it's still raw, write down everything you've learned from making that mistake and keep the piece of paper. And I thought, what a fantastic tool for learning from your mistakes. And he said when he'd done it, he put it in a drawer and realised it was time to put it to bed, and he could move on, but he'd never forget the lessons. So learning to take criticism, I think, has been a huge one, because it's not easy to take criticism, is it? Especially when it's very direct. But sports coaching does help you do that. So I've learned from that. Okay,
let's not encourage anyone to scream or swear at anyone.
No, absolutely not. And that there are some environments that I think partly when you're in a very deep concentration environment, like a sport, where actually only a tiny bits of it gets through because you're really so focused on something that you don't hear it. You literally don't hear it. And then afterwards, if somebody played a tape back, you'd be horrified. But in the moment, you just don't notice it. So, no, from a management and leadership perspective, we're not encouraging our message differently, but it does teach a valuable lesson nevertheless.
Okay, so you had another career as well, which again you're quite modest about, and you are a very modest lady actually. So, which is your work in business and specifically in technology. Tell us about you as a techie. What did you do and what did you get up to?
Well, that was weird. When I was coming out of sport, we didn't have the support that I think there is now for retraining and coaching and adjusting into a new life. So I sort of had to find my own way. This was back in the mid-90s when I stopped being a professional. And I remember going on a course called Computing for the Terrified and thinking there's an old IBM XT. It was a black screen with little green letters. So I was involved in computing quite early on just because I was giving it a go. I didn't know any better not to. I'd always done some journalism. So all the way through my dressage career, I was writing little bits for Horse and Hound and pieces for magazines. And my dad was a journalist, so I was comfortable with words. So my first job was in an information development agency. Nobody knew what it was. It didn't matter. Nobody knew what they did because they were making it up as they went along, because it was right at that period where people were moving from paper to online. So unwittingly, I ended up in a business where I was learning about data management, learning about labeling data, chunking data, grouping data, and learning how people moved around information. And I became an information architect. Sounds very posh, but it's actually just that, learning how people function around information. So I was accidentally at the cutting edge, and I was writing what now turn out to be algorithms for decisions for how people move around content. Fast forward to that, I ended up as head of content for Dell, and I designed an information system for them that pulled out all the information that salespeople needed for bid documents and put it into a sort of, they pressed radio buttons and it went and grabbed the right information. It was a server for a school for X amount, and it automated the proposal process. And that was a 4-year project, and I learned a huge amount because obviously I had to learn about servers and how IT infrastructure worked. So I've got a very good top-down view. I'm not a coder, I'm not a techie, but I do understand how people move around information. And that was early 2000s, and it served me very well because we're in a data-driven world now, and the fundamental infrastructure hasn't really changed. But I have followed artificial intelligence and how we've moved from content selection to deep learning. So that's a great interest of mine, and I've written a couple of futurism books for people based on that background knowledge.
There's so much variety. It's wonderful. It's brilliant. Thank you. Before we came on air, you and I were talking about the subject of mastery, which is another area that you're really interested in. What's your definition of mastery, and is it important?
It's very important to some people. I don't think everybody needs to be a master of anything specific. Some people are great generalists and that's their gift. Some people are really great at having a very broad view and keeping it quite shallow, and that's a gift in itself. There's nothing wrong with that. But for some people, if you're like me, then becoming a master of something is really getting deep into something, is what's fascinating about life. So I have a lot of these conversations with fellow speakers, with my dressage coach, with masters in all sorts of areas. And I started to realize there was some common threads. So people always talk about mastering the skills of anything. That's sort of a given. And I think we come from a background in the last 50 years of mastering skills, of qualifying for things, of learning the technical elements. So there's no doubt that that's one part of mastery. The second part of mastery is the mindset stuff, which is spoken about a lot, and a lot of people speak very well on mindset. But for me, there was something missing, and I couldn't work out what it was. And again, it was another conversation. I think it was on a ski lift with a fellow speaker, and stuff started to come together. And the third part of it, which I think really makes sense of it and starts to become useful to people, is that there's a philosophy behind mastery, which has a fundamental two polarities with it. One is people who become masterful at things are always striving for perfection, but people that become happy with the mastery accept that it's not possible. And that was the missing link for me, is this core acceptance that you need to keep growing your skills forever if you're going to become masterful. If you think of a Tai Chi or Zen master of a martial art, or a meditating monk, or anything, or a skier or a rider, or anything, or a people manager, a leader, you're always having to up your skills, because the more your skills become honed, the more you realize that they're not as good as they could be. So there's a perpetual chasing for something you can't quite reach. And then there's the mindset stuff, which constantly needs to update itself in order to keep up with the new skills required. So you need to get more resilient, you need to get more analytical, you need to get more inquisitive. So there's all those things. There's processes, mental processes, that allow you to push through barriers that you couldn't push through 3 months ago, 5 years ago, whatever. But the philosophy bit doesn't change. And that's this acceptance that you can never be perfect, but not giving up because of it. And that was a big one for me. It's almost like a quantum particle. It has to be in two places at once. Striving perfection, no, you can't reach perfection, and they have to coexist. And I think that's where the joy of mastery, people that have become really centered, find that balance. They find that place to exist in that quite strange philosophical place.
Brilliant. Fantastic. So Sophie, you were speaking this morning, you're speaking this afternoon.
Yeah.
What kind of things are clients asking you to talk about? Are they asking you to talk about the flames and explain them? Are they asking about mastery? Are they asking, what, because you could talk about so many things.
Yeah, people just want people to get on, I think. People want to become, their teams to become more self-aware. They want people to communicate more fluently. They want people to understand differences between different teams and objectives. They want people in apparently conflicting roles to work together. So they want operations and finance, or sales and legal. You know, there's always a bit of grit in the oyster often between teams across an organisation. So the common thing I find is they want people to think about their actions, think about their behaviours, communicate considerately, but actually be open. So have difficult conversations is always one. So it's really always about communications and behaviour. And it starts with how people think about themselves. So clients seem to use the flames, that they get the simplicity of it. And it's a leaping off point to have those conversations. So if it's communication issues they want, then we'll talk about the expression flame. If they want people to focus more, then we'll work more on the flow flame. If it's results that they need, we talk about accountability. So it's all around thoughts, behaviours, and how people treat each other. That one doesn't change, I don't think.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, they're people, it'll always be the case. So
yeah.
To finish then, tell me, Sophie, which flame is your predominant flame?
Flow motivation. Yeah, the mastery one, the one where I can get totally immersed in something. 2 years to write a book, 5 years to train a horse. But it's very in the moment as well, because flow is all about being completely present while you're doing something. And I find those things transport me, as did being on stage as well. I find this in common with a lot of speakers. They do the best work when they're not expecting it, when they're up there in front of people, and stuff comes out. You think, oh, where did that come from? It comes through you, not from you, and that's different. So flow motivation.
Love that. Through you, not from you. Sophie, thank you so much for your time. And if anybody's listening and would like to invite you to speak, you are available.
It's been a joy, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Take care.